Hi, everyone. It's great to see such a nice crowd. And I'm excited to hear Matt because I'm one of his biggest fans. I met Matt. He was known as Maddie at that time. I met Matt with his brother Ben and his mom Nancy back in 2014 at the Geddes Dam, where we had a red-breasted merman. No, redneck grebe. It was a redneck grebe, and it was my lifer. And I was both very excited to meet the hacks and to get my lifer. And I knew in my bones that I would be seeing more. Matt has been one of the amazing birders that have come up through our organization. We had him and his brother at almost all of our events. And we were so thrilled that Matt decided to do his PhD here at Michigan so that we could have more of him. He's helped out with the May count, the Christmas bird count, and all of our major things that we do at WBNA, even before we were WBNA when we were Washington. Now he's doing his PhD with Ben Winger at U of M, and we're going to hear more about his research. But I'd like you all to give a big round of applause.
Thank you guys so much, as Juliet said, for braving the weather today and coming out with no accessible roads to the downtown library. And yeah, I'm gonna give you a little bit of an overview of some of what I've been doing for my dissertation here at Michigan. And even before that, I want to thank this entire organization for playing a huge part in the fact that I am doing this today. One of the most incredible parts of growing up in Ann Arbor was having access to such an incredible community of mentors that really set me on the path to realizing that studying birds as a career could be an option in the first place. And it's been really incredible to come back and do that. And yeah, that has taken me back to a PhD at the University of Michigan. I am finishing my 5th out of 6 years in the program. So it's good that I at least have a little bit of data to show for that at this point. And a huge part of what I've done is tracking birds using geolocator technology. So you guys are going to see a mix of what that actually looks like in practice with some of the scientific motivation behind tracking birds in the first place beyond it just being really cool, which I think it is. I think this is an audience that probably agrees. And this is definitely an audience that understands bird migration really well. So I probably don't have to sell you guys on bird migration being really cool. But it's honestly one of the most spectacular and widely appreciated phenomena in the entire natural world, in my opinion. There are billions of individual birds that every single year undergo regular annual migrations. That's about 20% of the world's bird diversity, so 2,000 plus species of birds are migrants. And that means there's so much to wonder about and explore and study within bird migration. And one incredible part of birding in this day and age is the abundance of tools and technologies we have to better understand their biology. A lot of you participate in eBird, which has been such a big contributor to understanding where birds live when. So we're just really well equipped to study and track the migration of individual birds. The focus of this talk specifically is going to be on geolocator technology, so more on what that means and what we're using these little trackers on birds to learn. So what you're seeing here is a golden-winged warbler in the process of getting a light-level geolocator put on its back. So more shortly on how those technologies work, but their greater purpose is to trace the movements of individual birds throughout the year to learn anything you might want to know about where the bird was when and how it traveled and what it did throughout the year. And this is a pretty recent technology in the grand scheme of ornithology. The trackers have only really been small enough to place on birds for about 20 years now. So this is basically a mid-2000s onward technology. The first paper that put like a little tracker on a small bird was barn swallows, and that came out in 2009. But then over the past 15 years or so, this has exploded. There's now hundreds of papers that exist that have tracked at least a couple hundred of species throughout the world now. So this is a real revolution in understanding bird movement. These tags that you see there tend to be in the like $200 to $500 range, depending on what technology specifically you're using. So that's enough that most of us aren't going to like go out and drop like money on 100 tags, but for some scientists in some labs, that's an accessible enough figure that a lot of people are really using this as a tool to understand the birds that they're interested in. And the highest caliber technology, like what you can put on some raptors, has led to the creation of really incredible visualizations like this. So those are the movements of individual birds that correspond to the colors that you see there. So you can see even on the day-to-day exactly where each of those birds are. And that tells you about the details of their movements in a way that you never would be able to see without something like this. And so I think those are just incredible to look at. I also encourage you all to look at the Audubon Migratory Bird Explorer, which has compiled data for this throughout North America on, I think, over 200 species with over 17,000 individually tracked birds. So if you pick a species that's top of mind, so for me, painted bunting is usually top of mind for most things, you can just plug that species in and see their movement throughout the year. So this is a bunch of painted buntings that were tagged on their breeding grounds in Oklahoma and northern Texas. So what you're seeing is each purple dot in the top there is a bird that is in that location on that date moving along the bottom. So let's watch that again. They all perform a molt migration westward right there to Arizona before they start to travel down into Mexico and Central America, which was something that was suspected that this is something that birds in that breeding region do. But it took some geolocator technology papers to really track exactly what these migrants that are going to like a new location in the fall before they do their real migration, what they're even doing in the first place. So to people like us, it's just automatically cool to know where any one bird is at any point of the year. That's not always enough for like scientific journals and agencies to say like, go ahead, we want to see exactly what this one bird does. So the onus is kind of on us to like reveal new things about their biology using geolocators, but that's also a really cool opportunity to think big about like, what do I want to know about bird movement and bird migration that these tools are equipped to tell us. And over the past 10, 15 years, there have been some incredibly interesting things that birds do in migration that this has brought to life. So what you're seeing here is the paths that blackpoll warblers took through the years. So they call that loop migration. So instead of the bird just going back and forth and in the same straight line, the bird is actually migrating in a clockwise pattern. So it is doing that little orbit. It's moving in the westward part of the circle during the spring and then over the Atlantic Ocean in the fall. And it turns out that a lot of birds do that. Birds do leapfrog migration, where the birds that breed further north end up further south in the winter. They do crosswise migration, where some of them breed further east, some further west, and then they crisscross during migration. So many different things that are weird that they do. And there's been new discovery about like individual ranges of birds. Like we didn't actually know how far into South America veeries spent the winter until they started migrating about 1,000 miles further south than any of the range maps were showing. And even new information about endangered birds. So this is Kirtland's warbler data right here. And it was pretty recent in the grand scheme of things that we had any idea what these Kirtland's warblers did between spending the summer in northern Michigan and the winter in the Bahamas. And so what you're seeing is that in the fall, on the left panel, they move eastward from Michigan and actually stop over for a while in like southern Ontario and upstate New York, and then travel southward, partially crossing the ocean eventually to get to the Bahamas. Whereas in the spring, they basically take the most direct route possible and cover the least amount of water possible, and even go through McGee Marsh, which is where many people have seen them in migration. But that wasn't even true until relatively recently. And fun fact, last year I saw a Kirtland's warbler with a geolocator on it at McGee Marsh, which was amazing. And when I texted the guy who I was pretty sure put the geolocator on the bird, he was like, "You're the third person today to tell me that." Because it's McGee Marsh, so that bird had seen like 500 birders by the time I got to it. So things that we still want to know through geolocators. One thing that is kind of hard with geolocator technology is being able to make direct comparisons between different species. The process, as you're going to hear more about, is pretty finicky and takes a certain amount of like specializing towards each species to have any chance of getting something out of this. So it's hard to actually like go beyond what's the biology of one specific species and zoom out more towards like what does migration tell us more about migrant birds in general. So what if you want to know something related not just to those individual species, but something more like why do some species migrate so much further than others? Why might you have two birds that live in the same space in one part of the year, and then one of them migrates from here to Ohio and the other goes to Argentina? What does that tell us about other parts of their biology as well? So that's what motivated my foray into tracking birds. And that's turned into one of the major projects of my dissertation. So that brought me to the boreal forest system, as it does with many of the people who study under Ben Winger at the University of Michigan. A lot of you are probably familiar with the boreal forest. It starts in the northern Lower Peninsula of Michigan, so really only a few hours from the boreal forest. It's mostly this coniferous habitat and expands across the entire shield of Canada. And there's a very large diversity of breeding migrants that spend their summer within the boreal system. They have very different migration strategies. This is the destination of a lot of the birds that pass us over during migration. They want to get to the boreal forest where there's a ton of space and so many bugs. There's a whole mix here. You have birds like the junco that we're in their wintering range, so they don't have to go very far, all the way to something like the veery in the middle there that needs to go to like coastal Brazil. You can see a direct comparison between hermit thrush, which is a temperate wintering bird, a short distance migrant, versus that same veery. These are birds that are really closely related. They both evolved migration. That's something they both do. And during one half of the year, they're totally happy to be in the same space and then need something completely different in the other half of the year and need to do something wildly different to get there. And something that if you are a birder who has some familiarity with the region that you bird in, you know that birds are on different schedules. You can probably expect, like, it's April, you're very likely to see a hermit thrush, you're not very likely to see any other Catharus thrush around. And that's the type of thing that you pick up as you, like, bird a region. And it turns out there are some pretty regular patterns in terms of how that relates to how the birds migrate. The longer distance migrants, like the veeries, are going to spend much less time on those far northern breeding grounds than a bird like the hermit thrush. It's not just that the hermit thrush is passing through here earlier in the spring, it actually gets a longer opportunity to invest that time in breeding. Because there are really there are two things a bird wants to do. It wants to reproduce and it wants to survive. And the balance of reproduction and survival is what we call life history. So that's a broad category of biology in general, just understanding how organisms make those types of trade-offs. Because you can't be perfectly amazing at reproducing and perfectly amazing at surviving at the same time. There's usually some kind of trade-off that needs to happen. For migrant birds, one thing that's really cool is that they are separating when they care most about those things into different times of the year and different places. So if you're on your breeding grounds, you are caring most about breeding, obviously, and you're probably doing a lot of things that make survival harder for yourself, like singing really loudly all morning and drawing a lot of attention to yourself, and responding whenever you hear something else going on to defend your territory. Whereas behavior is going to be really different in the winter when you're just trying to eat and find food and not get eaten and survive. So that is the cool thing about studying migration, is that you can really separate the times of year where birds are investing in reproduction versus survival. So that's one of the main things that I was kind of interested in trying to learn more about when using these geolocators to see not just where the birds go, but how much time they're spending in each stage of the year between their breeding season, their non-breeding season, and let's not forget the time spent getting between point A and point B as well. So the main goals of this chapter of my dissertation were, first of all, just how these birds schedule their year, how much of the time is going into each of their 4 seasons. And then beyond that, let's say you just have the 2 locations where a bird spends its summer and spends its winter. So from there, by extension, you also know how far it migrates. What else does that tell you? Does that automatically give you enough information to be able to predict when the bird might leave one season and starts migration, when it might arrive on the other end, how much time it's going to spend in each place? And then can we connect that to those life history trade-offs? So what we went in thinking is longer distance migrants are going to be really constrained in how long they are able to spend in the summer because they just will need more time to migrate. But they have to be getting something else out of that, because you can't just have less time to reproduce and then also have a much harder time getting from point A to point B, because then that just wouldn't be something that evolution favored. So what we went in thinking was that longer distance migrants actually spend more time on their wintering grounds than short distance migrants, and that they invest more in surviving from year to year. So it's not just that the extra time gets sucked into migrating, but that they actually have longer winters in addition to those shorter summers. And geolocators are a really good way to test if that's actually true. This is our lead cast of characters. This is who I went in hoping to put the geolocators on. So for those of you who are not familiar with the species you're seeing here, from top left and clockwise, we see Veery, dark-eyed junco, blue-headed vireo, yellow-rumped warbler, red-eyed vireo, white-throated sparrow, hermit thrush, and Swainson's thrush. So I picked these because they are all common breeders in the boreal forest. I went in thinking anyway they would all be easy to catch. It turns out there's one exception here. And then even though they spend the summer in pretty similar places, they all breed in habitat that looks at least somewhat like this. And they all spend the summer, maybe not the literal exact same habitat, but close enough. These are roughly their wintering destinations, so it's a good spread of migration distance that we're looking at here. And they have really different schedules as well. Something like the dark-eyed junco might get to its breeding ground at the start of April because it only had to fly 200 miles from your feeder. And something like the red-eyed vireo, we don't even get them here until maybe the second week of May. So we also have a pretty good corresponding difference in their timing and their schedules. And I also want to give you an overview of the different technologies that I was using, because I put 3 different types of trackers on these birds. The first one is this light level geolocator right here. These weigh about 0.4 grams. So what this little tracker does is every 20 minutes, it records how much sunlight it receives. So what it ends up being really good at doing is picking up when the sunrise and sunset that bird experiences that day happens. And then from there, you translate it into understanding where that bird was on that day. So when I download the data off of a light level geolocator, I'm not actually getting coordinates. I'm getting something like this. So what you're seeing here is The black part means there is not light during that day at that like standardized time. So that is the bird experiencing night. The white part means there is light, so it's experiencing day. And through some convoluted coding that I'm not going to get into in this talk, you get first a pretty rough path like this that like broadly estimates where it thinks the bird is on that day of the year that you can then kind of smooth into something a little bit more legible. More recently, like past few years, those light level geolocators have really been punched up because now they also take atmospheric barometric pressure. So in addition to the sunlight, you can also see like what the barometric pressure was at that exact same time. So now you basically have two different types of data that you can use to like mask each other and narrow down your options of where the bird is a little bit more. Because there's just really good weather data that's constantly being taken of what the pressure is at every single place on Earth at every time. And so if the bird is in the same spot for long enough, you get like a good signature of, okay, it experienced this combination of this pressure on this date, so it must have been here. And then something like this yellow-rumped warbler here, each of those blue dots are estimates for where that bird spent the winter that you get from combining that light data and that pressure data. So it's not precise enough to say like it's definitely in like this patch, but it's usually pretty accurate to maybe within like 20, 25 kilometers or so, which is useful enough depending on what kinds of questions you're interested in. More precise than that is GPS tags. So there are also tags that actually take that coordinate. And when you get the tag back, you just download coordinate data off of it. The catch for why we wouldn't do that for all birds, beyond them being much more expensive than that, is that these tags weigh about a gram, which is not very much, but is actually too heavy for most of the birds I was talking about, because you don't want the tag to weigh much more than 3 or 4% of its weight. Above that, there's a chance that it could start to negatively affect the bird. Below that, they haven't found any real effect of the bird's survivorship or condition. So we only can put the GPS tags on the thrushes. And then these tags are so tiny that they can only store about 50 points worth of data. So you have to be very strategic about which 50 dates in the year you want that tag to actually take a point. But then when you do have that, it gets extremely refined paths of where the bird is that day, really without any uncertainty, because that GPS point is very accurate. And then for all three of these tags, they do not transmit data back to me. I have to find the same bird the next year and take it back off, which sounds completely impossible. It's not completely impossible, because some of you have probably seen before, you have like what seems to be the same individual bird coming year after year to the same tree. And that's because birds are freakishly good at getting back to the exact same points year after year. So about 30% return rate is pretty normal for these types of studies. So you're going to lose the majority of your tags along the way, but you'll get enough back to get some good information. Where I decided to do this was the University of Michigan Biological Station, which some of you may have heard of. It is towards the very top of the LP, just about 20 minutes south of the bridge. And this is land owned by the university for over a century now, where pretty much all of it is either set aside for like active ecology research, and there's also a small campus there where Michigan students do like summer field courses. And this took me up there for 3 summers. So during that first summer, I had about 90 geolocators that I put on 7 different species. Summer 2024 was the really busy one because I had to find those birds again and put out about 90 more, and then found those 2024 birds in 2025. But wait, I don't know how to put a geolocator on a bird. So during spring 2023, I had a lot of training I had to do. I was lucky enough to be able to go to McGee Marsh every week and volunteer at their banding station there. So that's how I got more comfortable with taking a bird out of the net, putting a band on it. And then this is when it really pays off to have an advisor with a lot of friends. Some of you have probably heard it here before. Does anyone recognize this exact road? Yep, this is south. South Stanley Road in Grayling, which is probably where a lot of you got your Lifer Kirtland's warbler. So the first bird I got to put a geolocator on was a Kirtland's warbler. The Smithsonian does Kirtland's warbler research up there, and I was able to be trained by Nathan Cooper on how to actually get that geolocator on that bird. So that little bump you might be able to see in the back of that Kirtland's on the left is the little light sensor on its geolocator. And they're also pretty feisty, which is good for them. And I also learned how to put the geolocators on when I was there. So that's the geolocator on the left. It's very little. And you have to make a loop out of stretch magic, like jewelry cord, because you end up slipping that little harness over their knees, and then you tighten it to the exact right tightness using crimp beads that you then just kind of crimp down. So it's actually kind of a hodgepodge of this really specialized technology with extremely mundane material to keep it on the bird. Yeah, no, literally, I got it at Michael's. So that's the little, and they end up wearing it like a backpack, even though like it's technically over their knees instead of their shoulders. So once I learned how to do that, I ended up at the Michigan Biological Station. So it's got a little campus like you're seeing on the left, and this is where students live, is those little tin shacks that you're seeing down the road. This is my tin shack during my first summer, and this is what a tin shack looks like on the inside. So it's pretty low-tech living, just enough to keep you going day to day as you're catching birds. But there's a really nice diversity of habitat within the biological station, and it's very pretty and nice to work in. So now that I've gotten here, what did I actually do? Lucky for me, I actually had some videographers from the Natural History Museum follow me around for a couple of days. So I'm going to pause myself for a little bit, and if the technology so permits, I will show you guys real quick the process of getting a geolocator onto a bird. See my code in the background. See if this works. That's Ben, that's my advisor, for those of you who haven't met him.
Primarily in northern Michigan, so around the biological station.
I'll start talking in a minute.
Peninsula, and then throughout the Upper Peninsula as well. And that project's being led by 2 PhD students, as well as a lot of really hardworking undergraduates who help us find and capture and recapture these birds, because it takes a lot of boots in the mud to find these birds.
My role in the project has been to essentially get this off the ground. So last summer and this summer, I've spent about 6 weeks at the University of Michigan Biological Station, where I've been in charge of tracking down these birds. We're doing 7 species this summer, 3 types of thrushes, which are hermit thrush, veery, and Swainson's thrush, 2 sparrows, which are white-throated sparrow and dark-eyed junco, and then red-eyed vireo and yellow-rumped warbler. So these were picked because they're all common breeding species in this region that should be pretty easy to find and track down and are representative of the songbird diversity that breeds in this boreal region, but they each have very different migratory strategies. You have to find the birds before you're able to catch them. So we are all familiar with the vocalizations that these birds make, and you get out of the car, walk around, hike around, listening for these birds. Go to the yellow round. In that very top of that spruce tree there. So once we've found the birds on their territory, we set up that mist net and use an audio alert to bring them in. Don't do this when you're birding. This is just for science. There he is. Male yellow-rumped warbler. So once we have him, we put him in this bird bag here. These are breathable. So at this point, we're going to go fan this bird and put a geolocator on it. That's part 1. Part 2 is coming. When we first catch that bird, we bring the bird back to the van, which is a bit more of a temperature-controlled environment for them as well, with the bag 23.7. Amelia's going to record some data that I'm going to look at right now. So It is indeed a male. Muscle score 4. Wow. Very muscular. And fat 0. So the birds don't usually have fat at this time of year. They're usually very lean and focused on keeping their young stronger. This bird is an after second year, and its wing chord is 71. When you're deploying a tag on a bird, once you've taken those basic measurements, the first thing I do after that is put a metal band on its right leg. Then on the left leg, I put that colored band, which is just a little piece of plastic that you can squeeze on. And then the bird's ready for the geolocator to be put on its back. The geolocator tag is attached to this little harness with 2 loops that's essentially a bird backpack, but made out of jewelry cord. And as soon as we're done with that, we let it go again. You can see the geolocator here on his back. That's the light sensor right there. So that's a really important little piece for being able to collect the data later. So it's just going to sit in his back like that as a backpack. Oh, you think he's ready to go? So I'm going to send him off. Now, hopefully see you next year. And that's the whole process. So now we're going to take down the net and move on and try to find some more yellow-rump warblers probably. Okay, that's enough for now. Also, we were in the car because okay, good. We were in the car because that's a more temperature and climate controlled environment, because when you have birds in the hand, they are not very good at temperature regulation. So we try to keep the car at the narrow range of temperatures they're happy being in your hand and do that geolocating as quickly as possible. So now you've gotten a sense of what it's actually like to catch birds in the field and put geolocators on them. You catch them using that audio alert, take them out of the net. You don't really need that right now. And we ban and geolocate the bird in the car. And then this is what the geolocators actually look like on their back for the 3 different types of technologies. That's my lab mate Max on the right, with a red-eyed vireo wearing that little light level geolocator as a backpack. This is a jump go with the geolocator that just does light instead of the pressure, and those ones need that light stalk on the back that juts out a little bit more, so you can see that from a little bit further away. And then this is a GPS tag on a hermit thrush. So on my hand on the left side, you can kind of see the antenna coming out of it, and that's what's actually picking up the GPS when the bird is in flight. And then when we want to find these birds again the next year, we put those colored bands on their leg, and they're a lot easier to spot that way. So this took me all over the biostation, but also kind of all over northern Michigan, because it turned out some of those species were harder to find in the biostation than others. So they actually have different little micro habitat preferences. White-throated sparrow like this wants something swampier and more open. Juncos want like open jack pine habitat, even like recent ferns. Swainson's thrushes exclusively want like thick, dense cedar swamps in the UP. That's our former undergrad Connor with the Swainson's thrush on the right. Hermit thrushes will go just about everywhere. So my first summer, I basically just spent time finding those birds and trying to put on as many trackers as possible. Saw some other fun critters in the process. And it's always fun to bycatch some birds that you don't mean to catch but end up in the net. So blue jays are very good at doing that. So when that happens, we just take a picture of the bird and let it go. 6 of those 7 species that first summer, we didn't get to do the yellow-rump warblers yet because we didn't get them on our permits in time. So we tried for all 7 others. 6 of them worked really well. Blue-headed vireos turned out to love to fly in and yell back at you, but not come more than like 30 feet above the ground. So they would not swoop at the net. So in a desperate attempt to catch blue-headed vireos, I 3D printed some birds and painted them like blue-headed vireos, and to see if they would swoop in at that like visual of an intruder, and it worked once. And that was it. So blue-headed vireo was no longer on the target list for the next year and got replaced with yellow-rumped warbler. In the meantime, I had to wait a year. There was nothing to do in that first year when I was just hoping that my birds would come back the next year. got back in summer 2024, got upgraded to a slightly nicer cabin at that point. And then in addition to putting on more geolocators, we were focused on recapture that summer as well. So we go back to the exact same points that the bird was at the summer before and look not only for the species of interest, but who's actually wearing those tags. So that yellow tag on a yellow-rumped warbler, you can see from pretty far away. And then you know, okay, we only want to try to catch that specific bird. So then you set up the mist net again and hope that that bird flies into the net. This is what a GPS tag looks like on that bird. And then you cut the jewelry cord to get the geolocator off of the bird and download it as quick as possible because you do not want to lose that after the bird carried it for a year for you. And then you just let the bird go and download the data off of that tag later that day. So some species were better at coming back than others. We had a decent number of swings and thrushes and veeries in that first year. Only one white-throated sparrow came back the very first year, unfortunately. A lot of red-eyed vireos came back. But we got representatives of everybody over the course of the 2 recap years, except that one blue-headed vireo never came back, unfortunately. So I don't know where he went. But I thought you guys might be interested in seeing where these birds actually want to go during the winter. And a little bit about their schedule as well. So one thing that was also kind of cool to note is that of the same species that we would get, they would usually go to really similar locations. So it wasn't like we had dark-eyed juncos representing the entire wintering range of dark-eyed juncos. They specifically wanted to go to like Ohio and Kentucky, the ones that breed around the biostation. So that was our shortest distance migrant of the crew. And then the hermit thrushes and white-throated sparrows also stayed within the United States. Our yellow-rumped warblers seemed like they were probably Caribbean breeders, or Caribbean winterers, excuse me. And then for our long-distance migrants, red-eyed vireos usually went to the Amazon basin in western Brazil for us. Swings and thrushes were wintering in the Andes in Peru and Ecuador. And then veeries were our champion long-distance migrants. They go all the way to like the southern eastern Amazon basin in Brazil, which is pretty cool that they do that and then come back to the same tree the next year. And borrowing a few slides from my lab mate Max, who had some specifically like GPS tagged thrushes, because with those birds you can get a better sense of where exactly they were on each date. So he had a hermit thrush that went to northern Mississippi, some swings and thrushes that went to the exact same places that my swings and thrushes went to. And what's cool about those is you can actually see what exact habitat they're using. So some of these birds were using some pretty marginal, like migratory habitat. They can do a good job of making do with what is available to them. And so that's a lot about our own data. There's also an exhibit about this at the Michigan Museum of Natural History that I encourage you guys to check out. They made some cool visualizations like this one for me. But what about all the other birds out there that we also have access to geolocator data for that could potentially be used for this? So once I had all of my data back, we decided to kind of expand the study that I was doing to be more of what we call a meta-analysis. So in addition to my own data, the data that other scientists found that was made like publicly available in some way or another, we decided to include that in some analyses too, to get more species and more individuals in the big questions that we wanted to answer. This is the transition to the more scientific part of the talk, so get ready for some graphs at this point that I will walk you guys through. So I spent a while going through the literature to see what else was out there in terms of available geolocator bird data. Some of it they make available in the papers that they publish or put on like public databases. There's one called MoveBank that's really fun to explore, and I encourage you guys to check that out as well. And then I also just cold emailed some of the scientists to see if they were willing to share their data with me, and some of them were. So we ended up having 51 species of migrants that we were able to put in this database with almost, but not quite 1,000 individual birds. And for each bird, the data that I wanted to be able to extract from it is where that bird was during the breeding and non-breeding season. from which I could derive their migration distance and when the bird arrived at and left its breeding grounds and its non-breeding grounds. So from there, you basically get like the calendar dates that are the start and end of the breeding season, the non-breeding season, the spring migration, and the fall migration. So we ended up with data throughout the country. So what you're seeing here, this is just a little overview of our data set. This is where the birds spent their summer and colored by how far they migrated. So those purple ones that you can see all the way up in Alaska, those are birds that went almost 10,000 kilometers. So we have a spread kind of throughout North American breeding birds, although if any of you know somebody who tracked a bird in the Intermountain West, please let me know because we don't have any birds from that region. So let me give you an overview of some of the big picture stuff we found. Longer distance migrants do indeed have shorter summers, and it's pretty drastic. So those are longer distance migrants on the right there, and their breeding seasons are much shorter. It does take you longer to migrate if you're a long distance migrant. It doesn't all come out in the wash there. They are spending more time migrating in the fall and more time migrating in the spring. And it evens out to about the exact same amount of time on their wintering grounds. There's not really a relationship between how long your wintering season is and how far you migrated. But that's got kind of an asterisk on it because the longer distance migrants do spend a longer part of the year in habitat that they could winter in. So once you make it to the tropics, you're already getting the benefit of living in the tropics at that point and being somewhere where there's a ton of resources for you and having it be easier to survive than a cold temperate winter. So the longer distance migrants do spend more of their year in like warmer, more hospitable places is what we ended up finding there. Long distance migration cuts your breeding season short on either end. So you get there later in the spring and you leave earlier in the fall. And that probably aligns with what some of you guys have seen with species that migrate through here. They also get back to their wintering grounds later in the fall. But then in the spring, it's kind of a wash because spring migration seems to be cued so strongly based on like day-to-day weather and like winds and everything like that, that it ends up not making a huge difference when the birds start to leave for their breeding seasons. But even though long-distance migration takes a lot longer, these birds are flying a lot faster. They're hustling faster to their breeding grounds and to their wintering grounds. It's just they can't do it quite quickly enough to make up for the fact that they're going so much longer. So it still takes them longer, but they're flying a lot faster. And we ended up finding kind of what we expected, that migrant birds have to make a trade-off between, are you going to invest more time in your breeding grounds or more time in your wintering grounds? And that corresponds to, do you as a species invest more in trying to be really good at reproducing a lot from year to year? If you get more time in your breeding grounds, you could double brood and like raise more chicks. You could have a better winter to try again if your nest fails. But then that's at the cost of you're in that kind of risky breeding mode for longer. So the trade-off is more time on the wintering grounds is it's great because you can live longer, but you get fewer chicks per year. So that's the trade-off that these species are making. And how far you migrate is kind of determining where you are on that trade-off. So long-distance migrant, like those cliff swallows up there, are almost always on the longer non-breeding season, shorter breeding season end of the spectrum, and vice versa for a short distance migrant like that eastern meadowlark. This is the most complicated plot I'm going to show you guys, so I'm going to walk you through this real quick. What we try to do is we have all those different variables that you can think about to capture what a bird's doing throughout the year, like how long it's spending in each season individually, when it's taking off and when it's leaving, how fast it's going. So I tried to kind of melt that down into one axis where I was like, probably there's going to be kind of repeated patterns, like a longer summer and a shorter winter. Those are, they're not isolated from each other, like they probably correspond to each other. So what if I'm able to kind of represent how a bird schedules its year in like a consistent profile? So that's what that y-axis on the left there is representing. It gets one single value that's capturing a lot of variables at once. So if you have a high value there, that means you're having a shorter summer, a longer winter, you're migrating faster, and it takes you longer to migrate. And it's consistently the case that if one of those traits is true, the other trait is also true. And the other side of that spectrum is the opposite. And migration distance is the main thing that's determining where you are on that spectrum. So there's like a whole set of traits that are associated with long distance migration, and a whole set of traits that are associated with short distance migration. So short distance migration has long summers, short winters, slower migration, early summer arrival, late fall departure, and all the opposite traits are true for long distance migration. And this is all stuff that we got just from the geolocator data. And that also connects to what we were thinking would probably be true about their life history. So this is telling us that short distance migration is what we call faster life history. So a lot of young really quickly, but shorter lives. That's the live fast, die young strategy. And long distance migrants have the opposite, slower life history. So live cautiously and long. Something that makes this a little bit hard for long distance migrants is that the world is not as hospitable to long distance migration as it used to be. So that's probably a strategy that birds banked on having a lot of consistency and longevity in order to make it work, because long distance migration means you are not getting as much opportunity to breed each year. So it really depends on those habitats that are so good for your survival in the tropics being there from year to year without any sort of change, and with a lot of consistency. Same goes for the habitats that they're migrating through from year to year. And that is not as true as it once was. So long distance migrants seem to be declining faster than short distance migrants, unfortunately. And they're not doing nearly as good a job of adjusting where their ranges are in response to changing habitats and a changing climate. So it seems that in this human-led era, that might be a strategy that is unfortunately backfiring for them a little bit, which is too bad. But the big scientific takeaways I want you guys to get from this is, first, this data exists in the first place and it's super cool, and we're really only scratching the surface with what we can learn about bird movement and bird migration using geolocators. And also just knowing how far a bird migrates is key to learning so much about that bird. It tells you a lot about how the bird schedules its year and also how it schedules its life in general. I'm gonna try to leave some time for questions, but as most of you probably would not be surprised to hear, this takes a lot of people to make any sort of project like this happen. So I worked closely with probably a couple of dozen people who helped me in the field at this point. I had a lot of field tech, I had a lot of field mentors. My first summer, my lab mates all volunteered their own time just to help me get the project off the ground. And I was able to make a lot of this happen because of Ben Winger, who put me in touch with the exact right people, also got me the funding for those tags in the first place. I had a ton of help from Andrea Benavides Castaño, who was a former master's student in the lab, who helped me put that database together for the meta-analysis. And this is not something that's possible without all the many other people who also did a geolocator study, who volunteered their data for letting me use it for these exact purposes. So lots of people and institutions to thank here. And I will take any questions that you guys have about any of this.
People online. Well, maybe I'll start. Maybe you can repeat the question for people online.
Mm-hmm.
When we were talking about recapturing, you mentioned that it sounded like you took the data that let the bird go. And I'm curious if I understood that correctly, and if so, is there a reason you didn't put another tag on it at that moment?
That's a really good question. So the question was, when you recapture a bird, is it accurate that you take the tag off of the bird to download its data and then let it go without putting a new tag on it? So that's a correct understanding of what we did. We didn't track it again. We could have. Other people have done that before to see if the bird does the same thing from year to year. So that's something that is out there. And the answer for most birds that aren't nomadic is yes, they do the same thing year after year. We mostly decided that our birds deserved a break after carrying our tag around from year to year, because it probably, even though there's research that like it's not affecting them in a major way, like I'm sure it's not the most comfortable thing, even if they get used to it. So we were like, they can fly free now. But yeah, so we just let the bird go after that. But we keep the bands on, so if the bird is ever recaptured somewhere else, they can get a lot of information about its age and where it was banded and everything.
Yeah, question for you about the daylight sensors that you're using.
Yeah.
So I understand how you're calculating latitude with that, but how are you calculating longitude?
Yeah. So the timing is always standardized. So it's giving you like sunrise and sunset according to like Greenwich Meridian time. So in addition to like the length of the day, the point at which the sun rises and sets is going to be like totally different based on your longitude. I'll also note real quick though that this gets really difficult right around the equinox. So a few days before and after the spring and fall equinox is when the sun rises and sets pretty much at the same time no matter where you are in your longitude band. That data is not useful.
Did you ever hear from anyone like in South America who found your bird?
Unfortunately, no. I think that's probably like a true needle in a haystack exercise. But it would be really cool if it happened.
Excellent talk, Matt. Always good to hear how it's going in the field. I'm curious about sort of the technology itself and about the new blue morpho tags that they have for the monarchs and where you stand on geolocators, especially since you got to use data from a lot of the studies of whether you're very pro the technology for these kinds of studies and where those limitations are.
I think that it depends a lot on what your goals are out of those technologies. I think for something like a monarch, what I've seen a lot of success on for people is like basically these are tags that are like tiny little stickers that they put on monarch wings that are really good at like basically registering when the monarch goes by like a sensor. And I think that there's a lot of potential with those types of technologies, but there's always going to be kind of a balance you have to strike of, first of all, there has to be kind of really solid research that this is not going to be particularly harmful to the organism. And then it also kind of depends on if it seems like there's going to be enough juice that's worth the squeeze for the kind of data that you can get out of it. But I think after going through this type of technology, going through the literature, I'm pretty open-minded to the potential in all of them at this point. But some of them have shown more potential than others. I'm not sure if that answers your question, though.
Thanks, Matt. That was a really great talk. I'm so glad you were able to give that talk for us. I have a question because we have a Lotus Station here in Ann Arbor on Huron Hills Golf Course, and I wanted to know what the advantages and disadvantages of the Modus technology versus your geolocators.
Yeah, so Modus technology is like super good if you want to study like the movements of like a population of birds within a certain season. So like the Kirtland's warblers also have like a really strong Modus network. So if you have any sort of questions about like how are birds using habitat and spaces like during their breeding season, for those of you who don't know, like the Modus stations basically like ping every single time a bird like comes near that station. So it could say like, you know, Kirtland's warbler F just came by at this time on this date. So there's a lot of function for that. it wasn't really applicable for this project in particular because it was so dependent on knowing where each bird was during like each end of its migration. So that would have relied on the bird finding a MODIS station during the winter. So I think that as they stand now, the MODIS networks are more useful for like single season studies, but the MODIS network is growing so quickly that I think that could change in the future. And it's also super cool just to know like when a bird pings a station during the migration, you might be able to learn like, oh, this bird that's passing through Ann Arbor spent the summer in this exact location. That data is kind of a little scattershot right now, but it's super cool when it comes out.
Thank you. We got a hit from a Kirtland's Warbler the first week that we put our station up in September of
That's
2023, but we haven't had one since.
That's great though.
Thank you again. I just want to first echo that. I didn't say that in my first question, so thank you very much. I have sort of a two-part question. It sounds like it's been a real journey since you started this 5 years ago or so. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about your expectations for the research and the project, and was it as you expected? Was the process surprising in any way? Were the results surprising in any way? And then I'm also curious if you know what you think you want to do once you're done with this, what you think your next step might be, if this is sort of motivated a new area of study that you want to expand on.
Yeah, thank you first of all. So I first started kind of cooking up this project during like the fall of my second year of the PhD. So that was fall 2022. So it was a long time ago at this point. And I'm just now finishing writing up the paper. So that's like almost 4 years if the paper gets accepted quickly for this project, which could take a lot longer than that, knowing how publications work. I would say that I greatly underestimated how long it would take to get enough birds during one season to actually make this work. And the reason that I had miscalibrated that was because my first experiences handling and banding birds came at banding stations during migration. And like I could easily find like 12 hermit thrushes, which was the number of hermit thrushes I wanted to do in a whole season during one day during migration. And I knew it wasn't going to be that easy, but I think I did not adequately understand at first how challenging it is even to find the territories in the first place and then get that territorial bird to actually want to fly into your net. It was much easier for some species than others. So it took a lot of adaptability on that front. And I also did not realize I was going to go beyond just the species that I was going to tag for the purpose of this project. I think it was really cool to realize that it was kosher scientifically to do studies like this that involved what's previously existing data. And it's been kind of fun to see that in action, that like it's possible to like get different results and different projects out of like the field efforts of these different people that might not be even like the original intention of their data, but it can still contribute to like a question that I had that they maybe didn't. And then this has definitely motivated me to want to keep doing this, I would say, like, which I thought I would probably want to, but I have definitely like affirmed that I really enjoy doing field research and I really enjoy doing bird research in general. So I'm hoping to find opportunities that permit me to keep doing that after this is done. And I might not be cut out for as intensive field work as some of my friends are, who are able to just like be out in the field all year in the middle of nowhere. But I think I love catching birds, and I think it would be really cool to have some opportunity to like maybe even open like a small banding station with like a specific like research purpose. I am trying to figure out ways to catch birds on their migratory grounds and kind of infer how they where they were during their breeding season and see if there are like patterns in how they move that way. I've not figured out how to do that yet though. It might involve what they call stable isotopes though, which is taking like individual feathers off of the birds, and there are kind of signatures of different like chemical combinations that can actually kind of map towards where the bird spent the summer. So that's been an idea that emerged from this.
So what you just said about the feathers were very interesting. Is there conventional wisdom on what makes a long distance versus a short distance migrator? Is it height of nesting habitat? Is it light? Is it nutrient density of what they eat? Do you know anything about that?
About like if there are kind of like ecological traits that make you more likely to be a short or long distance migrant. Mostly surprisingly little. It's hard to be a very long distance migrant if you're really heavy. So like very large birds are not super well represented as like very long distance migrants, but then again with exceptions as well. And one thing that's actually kind of remarkable is a lot of the time you see different birds that are like very closely related that are both migrants. Like lots of times even like really close relatives to each other are going to be like very different in migratory strategy. So it almost seems like the opposite might be true, where like you don't want to be too similar in your ecology and your migration strategy to like step on each other's toes that way. Like if you're going to be like living in a similar place and having like similar like food preferences or nesting preferences, maybe it's helpful to like not be in the same place all year or have a kind of different nesting window.
Interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Nice question here too.
So does the band have any unique identifier information on it? And do you remove the band when you remove the geolocator, or does the band stay with the bird for the remainder of its life?
Yeah, so the band has a 9-digit code on it, so it's like a bird social security number basically, and they're all unique codes. So I will record like what exact number it is, and then this is run through the U.S. Geological Survey and the Department of the Interior. So you upload after your field season, like these are the birds that I banded, and this is the individual band I put on it, and a bunch of data associated with it, like the place and time that you did it. And then second part of your question, the band stays on the bird afterwards, because sometimes it's really useful if the bird ever gets found by someone else again, that they can access that information. So big banding station operations like McGee Marsh will each year like come across a bunch of previously banded birds. Most often from birds that they themselves banded that kept going back through, but sometimes from other places too, and then they're able to figure out more about that individual.
I have a question. Matt, can you tell us a little bit more about molt migration? Many of us are not familiar.
Yeah, good question. One thing that certain individual species will do is before their true migration from their breeding grounds to their wintering grounds, will go some secret third place for their like pre-fall migration molt. And it's really only in the fall migration direction. So they're done with their breeding season. They're not ready to travel south yet. Most birds just molt before they migrate in essentially the same places where they breed, but a few will like pick a different location, do a movement, often like westward, and then finish their molt and then do their whole migration. So this is kind of especially common. This is more of a Western bird phenomenon than it is here, because molting requires a lot of resources to like it's a very energetically demanding thing for a bird to do. So lots of times birds that breed in more arid habitats in the West will find like specific oases almost in the West and do their molt migrating there and finish their molt in that like wetter habitat. So you find a lot of arid breeding birds finding like riparian habitat in the West for their molt migration.
Thank you.
I got a question. That's in the wild? That's you in the wild?
That's me in the wild with a bird called a red-eyed vireo.
Did the parents let it back into the nest?
That is the parent.
Oh, that's the parent.
That's the parent, yeah.
Normally, once they hit human, once they touch human as a baby, the parents kill them because of the scent of the human. They don't allow them back into the nest. So I was just wondering if that was the parent or the baby.
Yeah, that's the parent. So the babies are still fine with the parent when they see him again.
I was, one of the sort of counterintuitive things was that you said was that birds that migrate further are sort of more like live longer. And so first I was thinking that was partly surprising because migration itself seems risky.
Yeah.
But then also I was wondering, well, if they have it so good, like in the tropics, why do they migrate at all?
This is a rich question that has motivated decades of research that we still lack a completely satisfying answer for. But there's a few different kind of schools of thought for that. So first of all, it's very true, like migration is super risky. But it seems like the benefits of being in such a like resource-rich place for the winter outweigh the risks of migration. Which then kind of begs the question of why ever leave at all? There's kind of two different schools of thought that are not completely compatible with each other. The first is that because there are so many species in the tropics, there's a lot more competition for nesting. And so it's kind of more okay to be around those other species and those extra individuals in the winter when you're not really like defending a territory or trying to find space. They're just kind of traveling in groups looking for food. That becomes harder in the breeding season. So some birds escape to these more ephemeral habitats where there's just less competition for more food. It is also possible that birds actually evolved migration in the other direction in some cases. Like they started here and were like permanent residents here. And the motivation for migrating was to like find somewhere nicer in the winter. Instead of the other way around. And then the reason they didn't just stay there forever is kind of the same reason that they come back to the same tree year after year. They're just so hardwired in what they do that like even though they managed to get that exploration down in the first place to do that migration, they didn't lose it in the other direction because they're like, this is where I know how to breed, so I'll keep doing it.
I have another question.
Yeah.
So I know there are some physical characteristics that might indicate to you that a bird is a long distance migrant, like longer wings, I had learned. Are there any other characteristics that you're aware of that might point in the long distance migration way?
The shape of the wing can also be informed in that way. Like think more like swallow-shaped wings, like not just long but thin and pointy. That tends to make for good flyers, which tends to make it more possible to do those long-distance migrants. So, you know, another example would be like Arctic terns are kind of just like bigger swallows when you look at them, or like some of the longer-distance shorebirds like godwits. They kind of all have those same shapes and same builds too. These tend to be kind of long, slender birds.
Thanks.
Wonderful work and wonderful talks. Thank you so much. You mentioned that there's some studies showing that these geolocators don't increase the risk of the morbidity or mortality of these birds. Can you please give us some details about how these studies were conducted?
Yeah, so like one of the ways they would find that would be like banding a bunch of birds and only putting geolocators on a subset of them. So like if you let's say like you have like 200 birds in breeding in the same location, it's the same species, you put geolocators on 100 of them, and then you band the other 100 but don't put a geolocator on them, do a similar percentage of them come back for the same year. Because birds aren't super long-lived species. Some of them are going to die in between those breeding seasons. But there have been a bunch of studies now of like, is it a similar percentage that return whether they do or don't have the geolocator? And also like, there are some places where it's really easy to look at like one population of birds. Like there's a lot of the same species that breeds in the same place. Like, do the birds that they put a geolocator on seem to persist kind of at the same rate at the end of the summer as the other ones? So it's being able to make kind of direct comparisons to birds that don't have the geolocator on, if that helps.
follow-up question.
Yeah.
If there's one thing that you could add to the geolocator that you wish it could have gotten, like if you could do a PSA to the engineers, like could you really make this happen? What would you ask?
Well, if I could ask one PSA to the engineers, it would be like, please make your antennas on your GPS tags a little bit more secure, because we had a couple of birds that managed to flip their antenna off. So it stopped taking data after it did that. So that wasn't ideal. So that was slightly upsetting. But in terms of like other data that would be available, it would be nice if they could have some way of making the like light detection a little bit more granular, because it can be sometimes hard to distinguish night from being on the ground, which for some species that's not a big issue, but other species like an ovenbird or something that loves to be on the ground, like sometimes at dusk it doesn't do a great job of resolving like, has the sun set or has it just become duskier and the bird is on the ground. So some way of either being more sensitive to that or managing to incorporate habitat type would be super helpful. I don't know if maybe there's some way for it to interface with like a LiDAR system or something like that. I don't know if people are on that, but that's the first thing that comes to mind. Yeah.
Hi, Mandy. So great to see you out
Great to
there
see you
giving
too.
talks. I'm a birder that's just out in the field, and that's kind of like what I see, that's what I know. And I've heard through the years that the birds feel a warm front coming on and that stimulates them to move.
Mhm.
And so then the trees coming out should come at the same time as they're coming by, maybe marsh or something. But like some years, it just seems like the trees all come out.
Yeah.
And the warblers come.
Mhm.
Do you know anything about that you change between different parts of nature?
Yeah, definitely. So you're absolutely right that like there's some amount of just like following the year to year differences in like the seasonality that birds are responding to. So like birds often like to kind of track that green up of like the leaves are out, the bugs are out, and they're absolutely responsive to like year to year weather changes. Honestly, like the shorter you migrate, the better you tend to be at tracking that, because like it's just more likely that what's happening on your wintering range is corresponding to what's happening in your summering range. So like if it's a slow spring and a cold winter across the US, your like kind of cue to leave the wintering grounds might match up a little bit better with the fact that it's starting to get warmer here. The long distance migrants can't really do that as well. They rely really heavily on kind of doing the same thing with the timing year to year. So while they might be following a cue of like, I am going to wait until the day that there is like south winds or there is a warm front to move, it's concentrated to like a really narrow range of dates where that's even a possibility for them. And it's less likely to kind of match with what's happening here.
Thank you.
I guess, yeah.
Sort of a follow-on to that last question, but has there been any study about, particularly for long-distance migrants, how quickly they move, you know, sort of the last bit of their migration, depending on the weather?
There definitely have been studies about that. This is something that radar is actually really good for, is picking up on like how quickly birds are moving. And it's not always super easy to distinguish which species that radar is probably representing, but the like models that predict which species those are getting better and better. And while there's kind of like broader patterns for like some species just spend longer migrating than others, how fast they're moving in one day is much more about weather as opposed to either climate or like inherent evolution. So like whether they want to fly over Michigan in one day or 10, that's basically like, are the winds helping them? Is the weather helping them? And that's kind of true. I think long distance migrants are more pronounced in you being able to notice that just because they have like board to compare to and a longer traveling distance, but birds definitely are using weather that way in general.
Sorry, one more.
Yeah, go for it.
Occurred to me. And that is like the phenomena that we all see but don't understand when it seems like birds are traveling at night.
Yeah.
How are they knowing the way they're going when it's dark everywhere?
Excellent question. That's also a large field of ornithology at the moment is like, how exactly do they do this? It's kind of amazing how little we know to this point about like how birds are navigating, but they absolutely follow magnetic fields. So that's a huge thing that like birds are capable of doing is sensing like the magnetic fields and moving accordingly. So that kind of helps them with the bigger picture movement. They're probably also like navigating using certainly the sun and also possibly constellations. And once they've like made it kind of to the general area where they want to be, then they're probably relying more on knowing the landscape really well and moving within the landscape that way. But this is a super active field of research. There's some really cool papers that have shown that like when there's like a bobble in the magnetic field, which happens every so often, there are more vagrant birds. Like they got confused and ended up somewhere else.
Thank you so much.
Thank you guys.
So I'm Juliet, I'm the past president. Anyway, we should be having some more things, more events coming up on our website, Facebook. We're gonna have some moth nights. We'll have Swift nights out coming up in August. We may have a butterfly walk, etc. Pardon? We'll be going to Point New in August, usually around the second week, as we always do. So stay tuned and don't despair just because we don't have a whole lot on the website right now. And please do attend our restoration work days at the Sterling's Nature Preserve, which we have every month. Yeah. And thanks so much for coming. And thank you, Matt. Fantastic program.
Thank you guys so much. Thank you. Yeah, wonderful.